Okay, everyone, thank you for joining on time. I really appreciate that. Our presenter has a ton of really interesting information to cover today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, even though we have quite a few folks that are still trying to join. So before our presentation begins, I'm going to go over some webinar housekeeping and other information related to the Water Authority drought indices. So for this webinar, mics and cameras will be off for the duration of the presentation. Speaker adjustments can be made here where the arrows are shown. If you're having trouble with the audio, this is likely where you can resolve those issues. Also for this webinar, meeting chats, the microphones and cameras will be disabled. And given the amount of information that's being covered today, it's unlikely that we will have time to go over Q&A with the presenter. However, if we do, if you could relay those questions into the Q&A option tab that's located at the top of your window, and I will relay those to Maria if there is time today. If not, anything that is a little bit more than a simple response, please send that to our Ask an Expert email. I will put that email address up on the screen here shortly, and within a day or two, one of our experts will get back with you with a little bit more of a detailed response than we can provide today. And one last thing, our presenter will go over a lot of information in the case that we go over a little bit beyond 1 o'clock and you need to leave. As long as you stay until about 1 o'clock, you will still meet the qualifications for the webinar. So again, we encourage you to stay to hear all of the information our presenter will be going over today. But if you do need to leave at 1 o'clock and we're still going, it's okay to leave and it will not cancel your rebate for today's webinar. Speaking of the rebate, all of that $20 rebate can take a while. It takes up to 90 days to show up. There's quite an extensive process on our end to get that over to you, and it will show up on this line on your bill, the row that says total adjustments billed or unbilled, and that's where you look for it in about 90 days. Again, if you have questions about the rebate, feel free to email us at our Ask an Expert email address or our telephone number, which will again, I'll post on a slide here and at the end. Next, I'm going to talk about the terrible drought that we are finding ourselves in. It's really bad. The snowpack, the river, I mean, unprecedented historical lows. I do want to talk about the Water Authority's drought management plan. It's a little bit different, incorporates numerous issues. So the map that you see of New Mexico is from the U.S. Drought Monitor of the current drought conditions. 100% of Bernalillo County is in the severe drought condition. This is some of the worst it's been in a while. But the Water Authority also has its own method for understanding drought in terms of operations to make sure that we are meeting our goals and not in a bad spot. So the other parts that we look at are our gallons per capita per day, or how we measure our community's water usage, as well as our groundwater production in relative comparison to our goal for the year. So those two measurements we're doing really well. We're way below our community water usage goals and our groundwater production goals, but we are in a severe drought, which puts us into the cell that you see highlighted. And for that, there are a number of triggers that occur. We are expanding our public outreach, a 24% increase in expenditures over an average season. We're customizing our promotion materials, and as you all are taking advantage of today, we offer these drought classes or webinars for a $20 rebate for those that qualify. Because of all of this severity of the drought and a lot of the information that is out on the news and from our partner agencies, we're trying to take advantage of all this momentum to help folks understand the Water Authority's operational processes. Now, I think most folks understand this, but I think it's important to spread the word that we have a dual system. So when it is available and there's water in the river, we are able to pull water from the river via the San Juan Chama project and take a certain amount that is part of our agreement. In times of drought or low river flows, we are forced to rely on our aquifer, and we call it our savings account. And this means we're planning for this. When we are in these situations, we luckily have this aquifer that has been rebounding to rely on. And it becomes particularly important that we conserve water, because this is our great-great-grand kids' water that we are relying on this summer, and we want to conserve it and use it in the most efficient way possible. I also want everyone to know that the Water Authority spends a lot of time on long-term planning for water resources. In fact, we are the only utility in the entire nation that has a 100-year long-range planning document. We refer to it as our Water 2120 document. And in fact, we're in the process of a 10-year update at the moment. And what this means is that we can ensure that after 100 years and beyond that, we will continue to have a sustainable water supply. This is through conservation, which we're relying on all of you and trying to educate you about, as well as other projects such as aquifer storage and recovery and other means to meet a drier and less certain future. We have a number of great resources and incentives that I'm hoping that you all are aware of. If you're not, please check out our website, the 505outside.com. It's the best place to go to learn information about our rebates, all of our watering tips. We have hundreds and hundreds of articles from local landscape experts. We also have a great monthly newsletter that you can sign up for. If you scroll to the bottom of that webpage, we get in that newsletter, there's a plant of the month and several articles from local landscape experts, and we pledge not to share information with anyone else. There is our Ask an Expert email address on the screen, and we're really just here to help you folks. So any questions you might have about irrigation, rebates, plants, reporting water waste, anything like that, please send us a note and we will get back to you quickly. Today, we're really excited to welcome Maria Thomas. She's a local plant expert who will be sharing just a really small portion of her vast knowledge on low water use medicinal plants that thrive in our area and how to integrate those into your landscape. The cultural, traditional, and medicinal uses of plants is a fascinating topic, I think. And it also occurs to me that our contemporary culture of convenience has gotten further removed from this topic, especially compared to 100 years ago. So I'm really excited that Maria proposed this topic, and I hope that you all leave this webinar feeling inspired to have a new perspective on plants that you've likely seen in your daily activities, and hopefully a few new ones that you'd consider incorporating into your yard. And Maria brings decades of experience working with all types of plants in Albuquerque, and currently is working as the curator of plants at the Albuquerque Biopark. In this role, Maria manages the horticultural staff, botanical exhibits, plant collections, and related programs for the 150-acre Botanic Garden, public park, and zoo that we are blessed to have in our city. Maria is also an adjunct professor at UNM in the landscape architecture program and has previously helped to educate Water Authority customers with a great webinar last year on plant adaptations to desert environments, as well as contributing to other plant resources for the Water Authority. That webinar is up on our website if you want to check that out. So with that, Maria, thank you so much for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. As Amos said, I'm Maria Thomas. I'm the curator of plants at the City of Albuquerque Biopark. I've been working here in Albuquerque in that capacity for more than 20 years, managing the grounds, landscape, and plant selection. So, what we do try to do there is demonstrate the very best in horticulture and plant selection for arid environments. So with that in mind, I did propose to do this topic on how to landscape with medicinal plants. One of the gardens that's very close to my heart is the Curandera Garden, or the Medicinal Plant Garden there At the biopark, I use medicinal plants in my daily life and practice. However, I do want to mention that in this presentation today, I will be speaking from my learned experience, which is growing the plants and using them in a landscape setting versus what the practical medicinal use is. My slides do feature some of the general usages on the plants. Those are for informational purposes only. I always have to say that. If you are interested in learning more about how to use these plants as medicine, I always urge you to work with a healthcare practitioner to make sure that the plants you like to use are the right choice for you. So with that said, we'll get started. Let me share my screen. Okay, I think we're up and running. So yeah, here I am, Maria Thomas, the curator of plants. We'll move to the second one. I like to get this presentation started with a biopark land acknowledgement that we constructed as part of a program through the American Public Garden Association. I feel like with this presentation in particular, so much of the information that we get about our native medicinal plants, both how to grow them and use them as food and medicine, have come from the local indigenous tribal peoples in the region. And so I always do like to start with this land acknowledgement. I'm not going to read it out loud, but I do want to take a moment so you all can read it, internalize it, and understand what that means in the context of this presentation. So to begin my discussion on medicinal plants, I always like to start with the weeds. So bear with me, we will get into more ornamental landscape plants, but this is my moment to pitch integrated pest management and the acceptable use or acceptable level of weeds, things that we might call weeds in our landscape. So the first one is this Prunella vulgaris, it's self-heal. You can see this growing all over pastures and mountains at slightly higher elevations, although it does really well here in Albuquerque. What I really love about it is, and you'll hear this a lot in my talks and the way that I landscape the gardens at the Botanic Garden, is it is a living or green mulch. So it will naturalize and spread quite easily. It is highly adaptable to dry, shady environments, which if you live down by the Rio Grande or, you know, you have some mature elms or cottonwoods in your neighborhood, this is a really great plant to use. As you can see in that top photo, it is a wonderful pollinator plant, and it is so high in vitamins, minerals, and medicinal uses that it's kind of one of those plants that I always promote as something that people try to take out of their lawns in an effort to have like a monoculture green lawn, but it really enhances the ecosystem more than impacts the lawn in a negative way. It's also still very soft and beautiful, and you can mow it just like a lawn. So, you know, save yourself some time and energy and just let it be, and then harvest it for plant medicine. The next one is this broadleaf plantain. This is another popular lawn weed, and I think people use so many chemicals trying to get this plant out of their lawns and yards and gardens. And once again, it's a very benign plant. It will naturalize easily. It's actually what the seeds there, the psyllium seeds, are what is used in Metamucil. So it's a great digestive aid, a natural fiber. And it is, again, a wonderful pollinator plant that is a host plant to many of our native butterflies. So, you know, the more you know, right, the more you'll grow. And then chickweed, this is another one. You can see at the bottom slide how it forms this wonderful carpet. Very small root base, so it is not an aggressive plant by any means. You know, as it gets hot, it will brown out a little. But what I love about this is like the anecdotal evidence that this plant, which is great for stings, wounds, abrasions, you know, any sort of irritant to your skin, it usually grows right near plants like stinging nettle. So the remedy is right there with the cause, which I think is a wonderful story. And finally, the common dandelion. Of course, I wouldn't be able to finish a talk on useful weeds without including this one. And I do like to refer to this one in a story that my grandmother actually told me once about Russian thistle or tumbleweeds, that in the Depression, you know, they would harvest the young tumbleweeds, the small weed plants, but while they're still tender, and they would cook them and eat them like lettuce or spinach. And she said that, you know, it was a depression, they ate everything. But she also noted that because they were continually harvesting this plant, they really didn't see the pervasive invasion of the tumbleweed like we see today in our native rangelands. And I do think that like the common dandelion is very much like that. You know, not only is it a wonderful pollinator plant, it's good food, it's great medicine, but you know, if we were harvesting it more, then it might not be so persistent in our native landscapes. And finally, at last, we're on to our native plants. And I will start it with this green thread, the Thelosperma. The one that you see on the top right is the Megapotamicum. This plant, it's the rayless green thread, so you can see that it doesn't have any petals or rays. This one will naturalize in extremely drought-ridden landscapes. You'll see it all over the west side, growing in park strips. Up at Mariposa Park, they've used it as kind of a restoration plant that goes around the walking track there. Just survives on 0 water, and it is wonderfully helpful as a medicinal plant. It's one of the plants that are very easy to use and incorporate into your daily lifestyle by drying the plants, the stems and the flowers, and using them as a tea. It actually has a really great taste. And then you can see that the subnutum and the filifolium, they actually do have petals or rays. Those tend to grow, you know, slightly higher altitudes in general, maybe a little bit more water than the Megapotamicum. What I love about this plant is with these 3 species, they do create this nice, what we like to call a pollinator corridor. So the habitat connectivity that is established across the state with these 3 plants allows migrating pollinators to travel through the state at different times of years and have those wonderful plants as support as they go from region to region. So I think this in particular, and with all these medicinal plants we'll talk about, the more you can plant in big mass groupings is not only beneficial to the pollinators, but if you are truly wanting to harvest these plants then and create a little bit of a food forest with them, you want to try to provide as much space as you can for these plants to naturalize in your landscape. And then penstemon. So I love penstemon because we have 47 species in New Mexico alone. And so they're so diverse. You can find like this penstemon palmeri with that big bumblebee stuffing itself way up inside. Extremely drought tolerant. These plants will top out at 5-6 feet with their blooming stalks, so super showy. And then down on that bottom slide, you can see ambiguous, which is like the moth penstemon. And you can see by the habitat it's growing in, it just needs 0 water whatsoever to survive. So really a super showy family of plants, super useful medicinally. And, you know, if you're looking for a more kind of high color, high pop, there's a color of penstemon for every need that you have. The next one is this California or Mexican gold poppy. So that bottom slide shows down in Oregon Mountains near Las Cruces what the super bloom can look like. I know that even by Silver City this year, there's just this beautiful carpet of flowers in the early spring, which is amazing because, as you all know, we have had one of the driest winters on record, yet this plant can persevere in such massive amounts of color throughout the natural landscape. Not only is it a wonderful pollinator plant, it's very easy to maintain. Once it goes to seed, you can always cut it back. And with our multiple growing seasons here in the Southwest, you can usually get a couple bloom cycles through the summer. It is a very low level, low toxicity sedative. So it's gentle enough that you can even use it with children, which is wonderful. And then you just can't replace that color. And once again, no water. They also have some really beautiful cultivars coming out. You can find them through Botanical Interest. They have just beautiful pink shades, bright red, even a nice kind of lilac purple and pale yellow. So once again, there's so many different selections of this plant that you could find the color that suits your needs just with a little bit of investigation and searching around. This next plant, Mirabilis multiflora or desert 4 o'clock, is one of my hands down favorite plants for not only its medicinal use, but its pollinator habitat, its wildlife habitat, and just land restoration as well. So you can see in that top left photo that it is a night pollinator plant. So these beautiful purple flowers open in the late afternoon. They're very fragrant. And then you can see in that bottom photo the way that it kind of spreads throughout the landscape. So one plant can spread, 4 feet, and you can see how it kind of lifts itself slightly above the soil surface. So what that does is it really helps shade the ground and cool it off while allowing other plants to kind of grow through it. And, so in that way, it is a very useful living or green mulch. My favorite combination, or one of them with this plant, is using chocolate flower in conjunction with this, and they just kind of weave their way together through the landscape. The chocolate flower opens in the early morning. You get that wonderful vanilla scent, and then when the chocolate flower is kind of done for the day, the 4 o'clock will open up and steal the show for the evening. So really, when you're thinking about landscaping with medicinal plants and any plants, you do want to kind of look toward qualities like that, where the two plants can complement each other well in the landscape. The next family are these agastaches or hummingbird mints. They are interchangeable with mint, and what's really nice about that is, as you all may know, mint itself, like the genus mint, can be pretty aggressive in the landscape and also require a lot of water. Not so for most of these agastaches. The one that you see on the bottom left with that big broad leaf is a canna, and that one does need a little more water. But the ones that you see on the bottom right and the top, they're much more drought tolerant. And the way you can kind of tell what the needs of these plants would be as far as like water and sunlight quality, that top agastache, the rupestris, that has a very fine needle-like leaf blade, and it also has a very distinct blue-green coloration. So those two indicators will kind of help you know that this plant requires very low water. It has some great natural adaptations that help it survive in arid landscapes. So, and with the agastache families, you can always kind of, again, look at that leaf shape and size, and that will give you an indication about how much water it might need in the landscape. But once again, so many different colors that are have been selected from these plants that you really can find something for everyone. The next one is this purple coneflower, the Echinacea purpurea. I know this is kind of the poster child for medicinal plants. I like to include it in this slideshow because I always like to take a little time to highlight the coneflowers for a couple of reasons. The first one is that I don't truly believe that purpurea or purple coneflower is a drought tolerant plant. It's mostly a wet meadow plant. And right now, actually, I've seen a new planting. It's across from St. Pius High School in a commercial development on Coors Boulevard. And I think it's the Olive Garden. And they planted all of these purple coneflowers in front of the building in the sea of gravel off Coors Boulevard. So it is just a very hot strip of land. And there is no time of day that I drive by and see these plants happy. Now, one thing you'll see with the coneflowers is one of their natural responses to heat and drought is they will close their stomates on their leaves, and that creates a natural drooping effect. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they are out of water. It just is a drought response that the plant has. Why this is important is because this is one of the things that create adaptability in some of these plants that we use in our landscapes. And it's always good to note that in the hottest part of the day, it may always look like that regardless of the water that it's receiving. So the best time actually to determine if you need to give more water to your plant would be sometime like in the early morning when it's had time to kind of recover through the night, and you can see more what its natural response is and if it does need more water. So even more water requiring is this cutleaf coneflower, or the Rudbeckia lanceolata. This one, that top photo is a photo that I took up by Taos, New Mexico. So you can see that natural landscape there. It is a wetland riparian plant growing at high elevations. You do find this one in the commercial nurseries quite a bit because it's very tall and showy, has that bright yellow flower. But honestly, unless you have a high elevation, moist environment, or really site-specific area where you're getting a lot of runoff in a protected part of your landscape, I wouldn't recommend using this plant in particular for the Albuquerque area. Fortunately, we have this close cousin, Rudbeckia hirta, or the black-eyed Susan, which you all may be more familiar with. And once again, you can see those fine, narrow leaves. So that is always an indication that it doesn't need as much water to support itself. It's also a shorter variety. So, if we go back to the cutleaf, you can see those big rubbery leaves and that tall stalk. It is just going to need a lot of moisture to maintain that growth. But this one, however, it's shorter, it's compact, and it's got real fine hairs on its leaf as well, which is another indicator that it is going to be more drought tolerant. To confuse things a little more, I have a fourth coneflower, which is completely different genus. So Retibita caulifera, or upright prairie coneflower. So these guys are extremely drought tolerant. They have very fine leaves. They're a lot shorter in the landscape than some of the coneflowers. And these do best in the landscape if you're able to allow them to naturalize in big groupings. Why I like to talk about all of these coneflowers together is just kind of that cautionary moment to say that going by common names when you're growing medicinal plants and when you're using medicinal plants is not always the best thing. Now with the coneflowers, and things like the agastaches, so they are interchangeable as far as use goes. So the echinacea would be interchangeable with the retibit or the rudbeckias, but that's not always the case. So when you are identifying plants to use as medicine, it is always important to know the scientific name of the plant you are using and to work with that specifically. So the next plant, talking about interchangeable uses, this is one of my favorite native plants, Monarda fistulosa. It is the bee balm. And the reason I love this plant is, again, the story behind it. So when the Spanish came over from Europe and they brought oregano with them, they used it specifically for drying up coughs and colds, helping with fevers. And they arrived here, and the indigenous people said, oh, we have a plant that we use for that. And it was the monarda, or the bee balm. And so the Spanish adopted the name that my mother actually uses to this day. She calls monarda oregano, which I say, no, it's not oregano, it's monarda. And she goes, well, yeah, it's oregano. And so that kind of gives you a little bit of information on the interchangeability of these two plants. However, the monarda is native. And then, so the fistulosa is a little higher elevation, but it is extremely drought tolerant. The punctata, or spotted bee balm, which is in the bottom there, and it has that paler flower, more to the plains. And then a third monarda, which is as cute as its name might indicate, the pony bee balm, is Monarda pectinata. Now the first two are pretty tall in the landscape, so they can get a little rangy unless you have enough room to create big naturalized clumps of them. But the pony bee balm is much more compact, and so once again uses a lot less water, and has those same medicinal properties. One thing I do caution against with these is the Monarda didyma, which is the East Coast variety. I think it's called like Oswego tea is one of the common names. The didyma actually takes a lot more water, and it likes its pH a little bit more acidic. So keeping that in mind when you go to the big box stores, most of what you see in the box stores is some sort of cultivar of the didyma. So for the monarda, I would either try to get it from seed or go to a native plant store like Plants of the Southwest to get our climate appropriate plant. So the next one, Valerian officinalis, it is one of my favorites. It is not a native plant. It does naturalize quite freely where there's moisture. And so that, I would say, would be the best way to contain it, is to control the moisture that you're giving it, and it will be very well behaved. I love valerian because it has this beautiful white flower that is extremely fragrant at night. Those tiny flowers also attract some of our smallest native bees. And this is the one that actually is the chemical component behind the pharmaceutical of Valium. So that's just another interesting note, that this is one of the native plant medicinals that we created modern pharmaceuticals with. We actually do have two native varieties, Arizonica and Texana, here in New Mexico. However, I would not recommend wild harvesting those because they are conservation plants, and they do have kind of a more rare plant status. That said, you can get seed or small plants of officinalis here. I think Plants of the Southwest usually carries them in 2-inch pots, so very affordable to start your own valerian patch. And once again, that fragrance is like nothing else. So the next one, Liatris punctata, this is very similar to my monarda, is that there is a spicata that you will often find in the box stores that again is more of an East Coast native. It needs a little more water, the different pH on the soil. And so the punctata, or the dotted blazing star, is the one that you will see in the Southwest, in the arid Southwest. Why I love this plant so much is because not only does that big, beautiful bumblebee adore it almost as much as I do, and so you get that, but if you plant this plant where it can catch early morning or late afternoon light, when those seed heads come into being ripe, that sun will just light them up and it'll just make your landscape glow. So it's a really great way to create some beautiful winter interest with this plant. And then once the seed heads dry, the birds just love it. So not only is it a wonderful medicinal plant, extremely drought tolerant, but also a great habitat plant for all of our native local wildlife that we want to encourage in our yard. Okay, and so then now we're on to the Oenothera family, or the evening primrose. Once again, there's a primrose for every use. So the most drought tolerant would be this white flower on the left of Pallida. There's also the speciosa, which is the Mexican primrose, which is extremely drought tolerant as well. Both are very low growing and can naturalize very easy in our landscape. You see macrocarpa quite often in all of the plant nurseries. The one you're seeing in that top right photo is the Incana, which is the silver leafed evening primrose. So once again, that narrow silver leaf is a great indicator of an arid adaptation. So if you're selecting a primrose that for an extremely drought tolerant environment, definitely that Incana would be the best bet. Macrocarpa is also a very drought tolerant. It's, you know, and then Missouriensis is another one that's very similar to that. That just a little bit larger leaf, a little bit larger habitat, so gonna take a little more water. The last one here on the bottom is the Bianus, and that one is, it's basically a tall grass prairie plant. It grows very tall. It can be up to 4 feet tall, 5 feet in some instances. So again, it's gonna take a little bit more water. And what I like to point out with this one is unless you have a large space to really naturalize it in big groups, it can look pretty rangy as it falls over. However, all of these create wonderful edible seeds that support wildlife. So if you do have the space for Bianus, it's something that you can plant and you'll just be feeding birds all winter long with that. Yarrow is the next plant on my list, the Achillea millefolium. So this one you can see growing up in the mountains. It's not only for mountain environments, it does quite well down here in Albuquerque because it is extremely drought tolerant. What I also love about this plant is that it improves the soil fertility, so it can break up and add nutrients into the soil. This is one of the plants that's included in like a hiker's first aid kit. It was known to be used by the Romans as part of their battle kits because it is a very strong coagulant. And so I have a great personal story on this one, that I did make some oil one time just using olive oil and the leaves and flowers in a jar and letting it sit on the windowsill for a few weeks, shaking it every day. And then I cut myself while I was chopping stuff up in the kitchen, and I quickly went for that oil and dropped a couple drops on my finger, and I could watch. I mean, it was just so dramatic the way the blood coagulated. And so, you know, it's a wonderful styptic. You could probably even use it when you're cutting your pet's toenails, for example, and you go a little too far. So I think this one incredibly useful. Both butterflies and other small native bees love this plant. And just for so many reasons, it's great to include in your landscape. This one, Arnica, so Camisonus is our native Arnica. Most of what you see in the herbal, like apothecary, is actually Montana. And Montana has been so overcollected in the wild in Europe that it has actually been protected from wild harvest. So I would say, like, the first thing you could do about this plant is, if you're buying Arnica preparations in the store, try to see that it's from Camisonus, which is interchangeable, and if not, that it's from a cultivated source. The Montana exists from a cultivated source, and it is not wild crafted. Again, this one likes a little higher altitude, so it might be great for some of y'all in the East Mountains. Down here in the Albuquerque area, I really haven't had a whole lot of luck, despite all of my efforts to try to get this to grow. So this is one maybe better bought as a preparation, or if you have the right microenvironment, you could try it. So now we're going to move on to some shrubs, and the first one is my favorite, is creosote, or Laria tridentata. So when I started working at the Botanic Garden about 20 years ago, the only creosote that we had was inside our desert conservatory. Over the course of the last 20 years, the Chihuahuan Desert has slowly crept north through climate change, and so now we are able to grow this plant in the outdoors. At one point, only in the most hot areas protected from winter wind, but now at this point we can pretty much grow it anywhere in the Botanic Garden as long as it has the right growing conditions, which you can see in that bottom photo is very excellent draining soil and very much on the dry side. So most of us in Albuquerque have those conditions, and so I would add this one to your natural landscape. Not only is it a strong medicinal plant, but it is just a wonderful pollinator plant, and it's got that just that smell of the Southwest every time it rains. So for all of those reasons, this is one to really consider as you enhance your desert landscape. The next plant is the Mahonia family, or the barberries. So I have several different sizes listed here. Again, a Mahonia for every application. So the Mahonia repens is the creeping barberry, excellent for dry shade. And the Fremontii and Hemetocarpas are much larger, more commonly known as Algaritas. They all feature just that beautiful yellow flower very early in spring. It has just an extremely fragrant candy scent, and then they're all followed with different edible berries that the birds really love. And so great habitat plant. It's evergreen, extremely drought tolerant in all the applications, and just good, strong medicine. And then the Rus family, or the sumac family, once again, there's a sumac for every application. You might start seeing a pattern here where I am trying to go through these shrubs and kind of list out. So if you are on the West Mesa, for example, or east of the East Mountains, this microphylla or little leaf sumac that you see on the top left is an excellent choice, extremely drought tolerant. Microphylla indicates, yes, little leaf, and the little leaf indicates low water. And then we also have Trilobata, which is a very large one, and Aromatica, which is very commonly found in the local nursery stores at this point. So the Aromatica and the Trilobata have just gorgeous orange-red fall color. They all have these wonderful flowers in the spring and summer. And then what I really love about them is they all have these super tart dried fruits that are extremely high in vitamin C. My mom calls them lamita because they would harvest them and make lemonade out of them. The lemonade berry is kind of what that translates to, but it does have that very tart, sweet taste that you could just make a refreshing summer drink out of. And then the manzanitas and kinnikinnicks. So again, 20 years ago, the native cultivars weren't really great for our region. Most of what we were getting in the nurseries was coming from like the East Coast or the West Coast, acid-loving plants. They love that cool, well-draining, moist soil. Those things we don't have here. But in the past 20 years, growers like Plant Select have worked to create cultivars and selections that are more suited for our climate. And I'm drawing a blank, but Chieftain is one, and then Panchito is like the shorter, smaller version of the manzanitas that have been bred with more of our Southwest genetics. And so they do really well in the landscape at this point. And you can see from that bark that it's just a beautifully architecture plant. Has the berries in the winter, and it's evergreen, which is a really nice thing to have in our native landscapes. And then the chokecherry, Prunus virginiana. So this is another one. The capuline that I'm most familiar with grows. It's definitely a riparian plant. You'll see it along riverbeds in the mountains in New Mexico. However, I do have to say that this plant has demonstrated extreme drought tolerance. We were renovating our heritage farm. They cut the irrigation, and we have a whole hedgerow of these chokecherry that had been in the ground for about 10 years. The irrigation was cut off for about a year and a half through one of the hottest summers on record, and these things were fine. So with very little additional moisture once established, they did very well through some of the hottest, driest drought that we've had. You can see that they have these beautiful cones of white flower in the spring, followed by these edible berries, although they are called choke cherry for a reason. So cook them down, add some sugar, but the birds also love them and they don't need to add any sugar. And then you get this wonderful red golden color in the fall. One thing I would recommend as you look for this plant, there are standards that you can see are single trunk choke cherry trees. Those are brought in from the East Coast. It's a cultivar that's more native to the East Coast. I haven't seen them do very well here. However, our native choke cherry that you can get at places like Plant World and Plants of the Southwest, it's usually a multi-trunk plant and it will do so much better. A little cautionary word. It will go where there's water. So once again, you can use water or lack of water to control where you want this plant. And you might site it somewhere like in the downspout of a gutter from your home so it gets that supplemental moisture from your house. Desert willow is another one. You see this in the landscapes all over Albuquerque. I love this plant because it just has those big, beautiful, showy flowers, which is kind of uncommon for the Southwest. It is a little late to leaf out because it is one of those very smart native plants. It doesn't get fooled by our early fake spring that we have. So it will wait until it absolutely knows that summer is coming, and then it will expend all that energy to produce those leaves and then flowers. Desert willows can get very big and rangy. However, they have new selections that are both seedless, which I don't recommend, but if you don't want a bunch of desert willows over your yard, I guess it's a good choice. And also like Bubba is a dwarf selection or cultivar, which will stay much shorter and more compact in your landscape. So once again, a shape and size for any application that you might need it. And then the elderberries. So Nigra, Sambucus nigra, is the European black elder. It does fairly well here. I would recommend putting it on an eastern exposure where it can get excellent drainage and supplemental water. Or you can go with something like the Mexicana or the cerulean, which is our native blue elderberry. And those are more tolerant to drought climate than the Nigra. But they all have the same flowers that you can use medicinally, the same berries. Word of caution, these do need to be kind of processed or cooked down, especially the red elderberry, which can actually be a little bit toxic. So again, it's important to know which elder that you're working with. My favorite, of course, is this Mexicana. I think they have these wonderful gnarly wooden trunks. There's even one on the west side of the landscape architecture building at UNM that is pretty much evergreen. So given the right area, it's just a beautiful small ornamental tree with flowers followed by berries, followed by that wonderful winter structure. And then this is another one of my favorites. You might be sensing another pattern here that these are all my favorites, but who can pick a favorite plant, right? Anyway, so the hawthorns or crataegus. So the European hawthorns, these monogyna cultivars, there are so many different hawthorns to choose from. On those, Paul's Scarlet is a double flowering pink that we've used in the Japanese garden to replace the flowering cherries because it is a much tougher selection. Has really beautiful trunk as well with kind of a golden bark. Winter King is a really wonderful one that has bright red berries in the winter and is more of a standard or single trunk tree form. Thornless cockspur. Most hawthorns do have thorns, but the thornless cockspur does not, and it is a much smaller, more compact tree. Some people really don't like the smell of the flowers. It can be a little pungent. I haven't really noticed them on the other hawthorns, but that one it can get a little overwhelming for about a week in the spring. So maybe don't put it right next to your kitchen where you're trying to cook and eat food. Put it out a little further where it could be a focal point and you can enjoy the beauty, but don't have to worry too much about the scent if you don't want to. And then my favorite, of course, is this ambigua or the Russian hawthorn that you see on the bottom slide and the middle slide actually. So it has those brilliant red berries. They'll hold them through winter. And what I really like about this one is it's that multi-trunk form. So it's a great focal point tree, and it has just this beautiful green bark, which is really unique in our climate. And again, extremely drought tolerant. The birds love it. The fruits are very easy to use. It's even in sleepy time tea. So yeah, it's one of the ingredients in sleepy time tea because it's really good for your heart. But because it does impact the way your heart functions, this is definitely one that you would want to consult a doctor before integrating it into your lifestyle. And finally, we'll get to the at-risk native medicinal plants because it's part of what I do as the curator of plants at the garden. And I wouldn't be a great presenter if I didn't talk a little bit about these. So my first is the milkweeds. So all of the milkweeds, as you all may know, are impacted by pesticide use in agricultural fields. They are primary pollinator plants for migratory butterflies. The one that I love is this tuberosa because it is far more drought tolerant than most of the other showy milkweeds that we have, like speciosa, that like it a little more wet and acidic. The tuberosa is a shortgrass prairie plant, and it can deal with a lot of dry conditions as well. Horsetail milkweed is one of our native milkweeds. It is also very beautiful. It just isn't as showy in the landscape as like the tuberosa or the pink speciosa. Why tuberosa is great is because it's great to help clear out lung congestion, but it doesn't have some of the same cardiac effects that some of the other milkweeds do. So this is a great gentle one to use medicinally, and as you can see, is just attractive to all kinds of butterflies. So don't use pesticides, don't use herbicides, plant milkweed. Another one is this Echinacea angustifolia. So we actually only have this in the northeasternmost corner of New Mexico, where we have a little bit of tallgrass prairie coming in from Texas and Oklahoma. All of the wild echinaceas are over harvested, and so this one has a big conservation impact. And so my big thing with this one is, first, it isn't low water. It does need extra water to be happy. And second, if you are using echinacea as medicine, again, make sure it's from a cultivated source and not wildcrafted. And this is one of my near and dear plants. I remember my grandmother giving us this one when we were little for various reasons, is this yerba mansa. You can see from that top picture, it is a wetland plant that is a little seep, and it's growing just where that water is. That said, I've seen it in some pretty dry conditions down under the dry cottonwood trees in the Rio Grande Bosque. But because this one is dependent on wetlands, and if you've been to the Bosque anytime recently, you know what that looks like right now. I would never recommend wildcrafting this plant. You can find it at Plants of the Southwest, and it does grow pretty well given the right conditions. So this is another one like the chokecherry, where I would find a microclimate in my home, like the downspout of a gutter, the edge of a lawn where it's getting more supplemental water, or what I have at my house is it's just in a big pot so that I can kind of baby it a little bit in the shade. But again, this is a beautiful pollinator plant. It is one of our sacred medicinals, and so we need to protect this as best we can. Osha, speaking of a sacred medicinal, so this is the one, like, as New Mexicans, we've all grown up with somebody's grandmother, perhaps your own, giving us this plant as medicine when we were sick. You know, anecdotally, it's called bear root because bears have been seen digging this up to help, you know, treat themselves with the plant. This one, again, high altitude, moist environment. It's symbiotic with aspen woodlands. I do have a volunteer and donor that I work very closely with at the garden. They've been able to grow this plant both in their home in Taos, of course, and actually down here in Albuquerque. I've seen where it's growing in Albuquerque. It's on the edge of a lawn underneath pine trees. I myself have managed to never grow this plant successfully in Albuquerque, but because it is so specific to the type of environment it grows in, and because it's high elevation, cool temperatures, excellent drainage, but with plenty of moisture. Again, this is one I would not purchase if it was wildcrafted, and find it from a cultivated source. There are places in the Pacific Northwest that are growing and processing this plant. And so I think that that is kind of the wise choice that I would recommend for this plant. And I don't even have to talk about this one too much. It's the same environment as OSHA, and just right there, Cypripedium parviflorum, it's an orchid. So we know how rare these are for New Mexico. They are used medicinally, but again, you know, make good choices when you're out there learning and processing plants. Certainly never wild harvest this one. And I wouldn't even try growing it at home unless it's in a controlled pot in a windowsill. So the Sacramento prickly poppies are actually widespread throughout the world, and they are used medicinally. It's really interesting with this one. Some can help cure eye elements, some can cause blindness. So once again, it's really important to know what species you're working with. And this species specifically, Pinnata secta, is endemic to one area in the Sacramento Mountains. This is one of the conservation species that we work with at the Botanic Garden. And because it is just such a narrow range in that sky island known as the Sacramentos of New Mexico, this is another one to just be mindful of what it is you have and what you're growing. You might see these on the roadsides, and they might be Argemini, but they're probably not this Pinnata secta, because it is so rare to that one region in New Mexico. So that's kind of, many things may look like the same thing, and sometimes it's just the one in the one place, and that makes it unique. And in the case of the prickly poppy, it may cause blindness or it may help cure eye ailments. And so if that one species goes extinct, we may have lost, you know, just unknown medicinal knowledge. And then the Penstemon neomexicanus, New Mexico beard tongue. So this was listed on the New Mexico rare plant list for a while. Once again, I'll kind of recall that one of the earlier slides of the penstemons and our 47 species in New Mexico. So yeah, we have 47 species. This one is on the verge of being rare, only because of overgrazing by wild horses down in the Sacramentos and the Gilas. And so there you see that checker spot butterfly. It's been in the news quite a bit lately because it is near extinct, possibly extinct in the wild. And one of the reasons is that the Penstemon neomexicanus is its primary host plant, and the primary host plant has been impacted by overgrazing. And so you can see where like the ecological chain just starts to fail once one thing happens. It can lead to the kind of the tumbling of all the other things. And so that's why it's important, again, to know the species you're working with and know what their conservation status are. This is another one that is impacted due to land use, as the Lomatium dissectum, fernleaf biscuit root. So this one, again, some anecdotal stories, some anthropological writings about the Spanish flu and how certain Great Basin cultures were able to survive the Spanish flu by using this plant as medicine. While everybody else around them was dying from the Spanish flu, they managed to maintain good health and get through that pandemic by using this plant. Unfortunately, the primary ecological concern for this is land use. So things like the Four Corners area where this one is native, just heavy impact with mining and drilling and grazing in arid environments. So with that, we'll just do a quick what you can do. And I think I've said this a few times, but don't buy wild harvested or wild crafted herbal supplements that contain any of these at-risk plants, or at least know where these products are coming from before you purchase them. Seek alternate herbs when available. So like in the case of rudbeckia versus echinacea, the rudbeckia might be the alternate that you can use, and then get involved and, you know, support local and global conservation efforts. And you can find out more about all of that here on my resources list. So Strictly Medicinal Seeds, I think, is a wonderful company out of Oregon. They have some great seed selections that you can find. They also sell rhizomes and live plants in excellent quality. Plants of the Southwest always has an amazing selection of native plants and native medicinal plants, many of them in the smaller sizes, so you can really start a medicinal plant garden on a budget by shopping there. Mountain Valley Growers is a mail order plant, and not necessarily what we've been talking about now, but they do have a lot of really amazing lavenders and thymes and oreganos and cistuses from arid regions around the world, so very suitable for our climate. And then these companies, New Mexico Rare Plant Technical Council, you can find about conservation status of some of our plants, United Plant Savers, Traditional Medicinals, Fair Wild, and one of my favorite organizations that brings it all together is the Center for Plant Conservation. You'll be able to find out more about all of these through your Ask an Expert or emailing through the Water Utility Authority. They can share this with you. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. I really appreciate your time today, and I hope I've inspired you to landscape not only with medicinal plants, but and support native habitat and just grow beautiful. Have a great day.
Well, thank you so much, Maria. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot. I really appreciate hearing your plant expertise. It just helps me many reminders of good ways of speaking with people and just all the differences and choices we have. I really appreciate that. And I'm excited to go plant some of the shrubs that you recommended. Just a reminder to our participants, we will send a follow-up email next week that will have some of the resources that were discussed today, along with the links that Maria had on her last slide. So don't worry if you weren't able to write those down. We have all of the information we need for you to receive the webinar, which will appear within about 90 days. You will receive a link to the recording of this webinar, and then we hope to get the webinar posted up to our website within the coming weeks. So thank you all again for attending, and check out the other webinars that we have coming up through the end of the season. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.